The wallpaper breathed against his palm, warm and wet like living skin. Thomas pulled his hand away, but the impression of his fingers remained pressed into the floral pattern, slowly filling with something that looked like blood, but smelled like his mother's perfume. He had been standing in this hallway for 3 hours, though the grandfather clock at the end had only moved forward 7 minutes. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Forgetting. The invitation had come written on paper that crumbled at his touch, delivered by a postman who cast no shadow and whose face Thomas couldn't quite focus on. The message was simple: "In a hollow house protects those who have nowhere else to go. You qualify." After Greysteel Manor, after the trials that had left him with eyes that saw too much and hands that remembered violence he'd never committed, Thomas had wandered England's back roads for weeks. People avoided him now, not because they feared him, but because something in their primitive hindbrain recognized that he was no longer entirely human. Children cried when he passed. Dogs whimpered and hid. So when the invitation came, promising shelter and understanding, he had followed the map's impossible directions through forests that shouldn't exist and down roads that appeared only when he needed them. The hollow house stood at the edge of a town whose name changed depending on which direction you approached from. Gothic Revival architecture twisted upward into a sky that seemed perpetually overcast, as if the building itself cast a shadow over the heavens. The windows were wrong, too many on the outside, too few from within, and some that showed different views depending on the angle of observation. "Welcome, Thomas Blackwood." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the walls themselves. The front door opened before he could knock, revealing a foyer that stretched impossibly far, with a staircase that split and reformed like a branching river. Inside, he met the others. Sarah Millicent had been institutionalized for claiming she could hear her dead father's voice in radio static. Now the static followed her everywhere, crackling softly around her pale figure like an auditory halo. She looked at Thomas with eyes that had seen too much, and nodded once in recognition. "You've got the look," she said, "the look of someone who's been invited to remember things they never forgot." Marcus Thorne spoke only in whispers, because anything louder caused the walls to respond in kind, amplifying his words until they became screams. He'd survived something called the Mirror Plague, where his reflection had tried to trade places with him. The attempt had failed, but left him partially displaced. Sometimes his shadow fell in the wrong direction, sometimes his footsteps echoed before he took them. And then there was Elena Voss, who introduced herself simply as Spawn, the one who refused to die properly. She'd been in a car accident at 17, declared dead for 4 minutes, then returned with memories of places that didn't exist, and people who'd never been born. The transition had left her translucent around the edges, as if she existed slightly outside normal reality. "And the house chose us," Elena explained as she led Thomas through corridors that rearranged themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them. "It collects people who've fallen through the cracks of the world, but it doesn't do it out of kindness." "Then why?" Thomas asked. Elena paused at a door marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "And because we're weapons now, and someone's planning a war. Or." That first night, Thomas was given a room on the 2nd floor, though he could have sworn he'd climbed 3 flights of stairs to reach it. The space was sparse but comfortable, a bed with sheets that smelled of lavender and something underneath that might have been fear, a wardrobe filled with clothes that fit him perfectly despite being decades out of style, and a window that showed a garden he'd never seen but somehow remembered. "Don't follow your own footsteps," whispered a voice that might have been the house itself. "The loops here don't always lead back to where you started." Thomas looked down and saw footprints in the dust, his own, but pressed deeper than his current weight should have allowed, as if they'd been made by someone heavier, older, carrying a burden he couldn't yet comprehend. He carefully stepped around them and fell asleep to the sound of the walls breathing. Chapter 2. The Room That Remembered. Thomas woke holding a candle that hadn't been there when he'd gone to sleep. The flame danced without any wind, casting shadows that moved independently of the objects that should have created them. In his mouth was a name, Catherine, though he'd never known anyone by that name, had never even liked the sound of it. But as he lay there in the pre-dawn darkness, he could almost see her. Auburn hair, green eyes, a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. She was important somehow. She was connected to everything that had happened to him, everything that was still happening. And she was angry. Catherine, he whispered to the empty room, and the candle flame guttered as if someone had blown on it. The room around him was wrong. Not his room. This one was smaller, with different wallpaper, different furniture. A child's room, with toys scattered on the floor and drawings pinned to the walls. The drawings showed scenes he recognized, the orphanage where he'd grown up, the schools he'd attended, the trials he'd survived. But in these pictures, he wasn't alone. A small girl with auburn hair stood beside him in each scene, sometimes holding his hand, sometimes whispering in his ear, sometimes bleating. "Do you remember what you did to her?" A voice came from inside the walls, from inside his own chest. "Do you remember why she had to go away?" "Ah!" Thomas stumbled to his feet, the candle wavering in his grip. He had to get out of this room, had to get back to his own space, but when he reached for the door handle, his fingers passed through it like mist. "And this isn't real," he said aloud, but his voice sounded thin and unconvincing. "Unreal is a relative concept here," and came Sarah's voice from somewhere behind him. He spun around, but she wasn't there, just her radio static, crackling softly from a speaker that hadn't existed moments before. "And the house shows us what we need to see. The question is, do you need to see this, or does it need you to see it?" The drawings on the wall began to move. In one, the paper version of himself turned and looked directly at him, mouthing words he couldn't hear. In another, the girl, Catherine, pointed at something outside the frame, her face twisted with accusation. "She trusted you," the walls whispered. "She followed you because she trusted you, and you led her into the dark." Memory fragments crashed through Thomas's mind like shards of broken glass. A small hand in his, warm and trusting. A game of hide-and-seek that went too far. Door that should have stayed closed. Screaming that stopped too suddenly. Blood on white shoes. Running, always running, but never fast enough to escape what he'd done. "No," Thomas gasped, pressing his palms against his temples. "No, that didn't happen. I would remember her." But even as he said it, he could feel the memories settling into place, like pieces of a puzzle he'd been unconsciously assembling his entire life. Catherine wasn't just a name. She was the reason he'd been alone at the orphanage, the reason the other children had whispered about him, the reason the staff had looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear. She was his sister, and he had killed her. Chapter 3. The Museum of Alternate Selves. The candle led him through the house, its flame pulling him forward like a compass needle pointing toward magnetic north. Thomas followed because he had no choice. His feet moved of their own accord, tracing paths through corridors that folded and unfolded around him like origami made of shadow and memory. He passed doors that opened onto impossible scenes, a classroom where all the students had his face, a library where the books wrote themselves, a dining room where empty chairs pulled themselves up to a table set for one. Each glimpse lasted only a moment before the doors swung shut, but the images burned into his retinas like camera flashes. "Never sleep in the attic twice," Marcus's whisper drifted down from somewhere above. "The first time you dream of who you were. The second time you become who you might have been. The third time, well, there isn't a third time." Thomas looked up and saw stairs leading to an attic door that stood slightly ajar. Light spilled through the gap, not electric light, but the warm glow of late afternoon sun, impossible at this hour before dawn. He could hear sounds from within, children playing, a woman humming, the comfortable chaos of a family home. His feet began carrying him toward the stairs. "Don't," he told himself, but the word came out as Catherine instead, and the candle flame leaped higher, eager. Each step up the narrow staircase brought the sounds closer, more distinct. He could make out individual voices now, his own, but younger, breathless with excitement. A girl's laughter, bright and musical. A woman singing a lullaby he almost remembered. The attic door swung open at his approach, revealing a scene that made his chest tighten with longing so acute it felt like drowning. A living room decorated for Christmas, warm with firelight and the smell of cinnamon. A woman with auburn hair, older Catherine, the Catherine who would have grown up, knelt beside a Christmas tree, helping two children unwrap presents. One of the children was unmistakably Thomas, but unmarked by the trials and transformations that had shaped him. This version laughed without restraint, his eyes bright with simple joy. The other child was a girl of perhaps 8, with the same auburn hair as the woman, the same green eyes. She held up a doll with painted features and exclaimed, "Look, Thomas, she looks just like me." And the woman, their mother, Thomas realized with a shock of recognition, smiled and said, "Well, she's beautiful, Catherine, just like her owner." "And this is wrong," Thomas whispered, but he couldn't look away. This didn't happen. This couldn't have happened. But as he watched, the scene began to shift, the warm light fading to something colder. The Christmas tree withered, its ornaments falling like tears. The woman's smile became strained, desperate. The children's laughter took on a note of hysteria. "Thomas," the woman said, and her voice carried the weight of years, of choices unmade and paths not taken. "Thomas, Thomas, why didn't you save her? Why didn't you save us?" The alternate Thomas in the scene turned to look directly at him, and his unmarked face was full of accusation. You could have chosen this," he said. "You could have been me, but you chose the dark instead." The scene shattered like a mirror struck by a stone, leaving Thomas alone in an empty attic that smelled of dust and regret. But as he turned to flee, he caught sight of something scratched into the wooden floor. Catherine Blackwood, beloved daughter and sister. She should have lived. Chapter 4, The Nursery of Never Was. The candle guttered and died as Thomas stumbled back down the attic stairs, leaving him in darkness that felt thick and oppressive. But the house itself seemed to glow faintly, as if phosphorescent paint had been mixed into the wallpaper, providing just enough light to navigate by. He tried to return to his room, but every door he opened led somewhere else. A bathroom where the mirror showed his reflection as a much older man, scarred and hollow-eyed. A kitchen, where pots bubbled on the stove, cooking meals for people who would never come home. A study where books fell open to pages that told his story in languages he didn't recognize but somehow understood. Mirrors reset reality. Don't use them. Elena's voice drifted from behind a door he'd already tried twice, though it had been locked both times. Now it stood open, revealing a room that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. It was a nursery, but not the idealized version from the attic. This was Catherine's actual room, preserved exactly as it had been on the day she died. Pink wallpaper with dancing teddy bears, a crib with mobile of spinning stars, toys scattered across the floor as if their owner had just stepped out to play. But everything was subtly wrong. The teddy bears in the wallpaper pattern weren't dancing. They were fleeing, their button eyes wide with terror. The mobile spun too fast, creating a nauseating blur of light and shadow. The toys were positioned with deliberate care, arranged to spell out words and help in alphabet blocks. Why? In plastic letters, and remember, in miniature soldiers standing at attention. Thomas stepped into the room, and immediately the temperature dropped to 20 degrees. His breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, and frost began forming on the windows despite the summer weather outside. In the center of the room sat a rocking chair, moving slowly back and forth with no one in it. As Thomas watched, the impression of a small body began to appear in the seat, not visible exactly, but a weight that pressed down the cushions, a presence that disturbed the air. "Do you remember what you did to her?" The voice was different now, not the house speaking, but something smaller, younger, a child's voice, damaged by trauma and death. "Do you remember the game you played? The memories came flooding back, no longer fragmented but whole and terrible. Catherine had been 5 when it happened, Thomas 7. They'd been playing in the old mansion that would later become the first school he'd attend. But then it had just been an abandoned house, a place children dared each other to explore. "Let's play hide and seek," he'd suggested, because he'd been there before, knew all the best hiding places. "Yeah, and don't want to," Catherine had said, clinging to his hand. "It's scary here." And don't be a baby," he'd replied, the casual cruelty of childhood. "I'll count to 50. You hide." She disappeared into the shadows of the house, and he'd counted slowly, savoring the anticipation. When he'd gone looking for her, he'd found her in the east wing, in a room that shouldn't have existed, touching symbols carved into the stone. And the symbols had begun to glow at her touch, and something had stirred in the darkness beyond. Something that had been waiting for a child's hand, a child's innocence to open the way. Thomas had watched, frozen with terror, as his sister had been pulled into the shadows. Her screams had echoed through the mansion, growing fainter and more distant until they'd stopped altogether. And he'd run then, left her there, told no one. When the police had searched, they'd found no trace of her. The east wing had been empty, unremarkable. The symbols were gone, as if they'd never existed. But Thomas remembered. Thomas had always remembered, even when he'd tried to forget. "You opened the door," Catherine's voice whispered from the rocking chair, "and you brought me to that place, and when the shadows took me, you ran away." "I was just a child," and Thomas pleaded, tears streaming down his face, "and I didn't understand what would happen." "Neither did I," she replied, and now he could see her, pale and translucent, still 5 years old, still wearing the white dress she'd died in. "But I'm the one who paid the price." The nursery began to change around them, the walls stretching upward, the ceiling disappearing into darkness. The toys on the floor rearranged themselves into new patterns, spelling out accusations and pleas and fragments of the conversations they'd never had. "I've been waiting for you," Catherine said, rising from the rocking chair. "When waiting for you to remember, to come back and finish what you started." "Oh, what do you mean?" Thomas asked, though part of him already knew. "The door you opened that day, it's still open. It's been pulling things through ever since, things that shouldn't exist in this world. The schools you attended, the trials you've faced, the transformations you've undergone. They're all consequences of that moment when you let the shadows in." She moved closer, and Thomas could feel the cold radiating from her small form like winter wind. "You're not becoming something else, Thomas. You're becoming what you always were, the key that opens doors between worlds, the bridge that lets the darkness cross over." "How do I stop it?" he whispered. Catherine smiled, and her expression was terrible in its forgiveness. "One, you can't, but you can choose what comes through next." Chapter 5. The Democracy of Doors. Thomas fled the nursery, but the house had other plans. Corridors folded around him like the pages of a closing book, leading him deeper into its architecture of impossible angles and recursive geometry. Every door he passed stood slightly ajar, offering glimpses of lives he might have lived, choices he might have made. Behind one door, Thomas is a successful businessman, never having left the normal world, never knowing about the darkness that lurked in its margins. He was giving a presentation to a room full of executives, but their faces were all blank, empty, as if they were waiting for someone to draw in their features. Behind another, Thomas as an inmate in an asylum, rocking back and forth in a padded cell, muttering about schools that moved in the night and sisters who died in shadows. The orderlies who brought his meals had Catherine's face, but they never acknowledged him when he called her name. Behind a third, Thomas as he was now, but different, confident, purposeful, leading a group of other transformed individuals through a war against entities that had invaded from beyond. In this version, Catherine stood beside him, grown to adulthood, her eyes burning with the same inhuman light that flickered in his own. "The names you forget were taken." Sarah's static-laced voice drifted through the walls, but sometimes they come back, changed by their time in the space between memory and forgetting. Thomas paused at a door marked with symbols he recognized from the east wing of that first school. His hand moved toward the handle of its own accord, but before he could turn it, Elena appeared beside him, her translucent form flickering like a bad television signal. "Don't," she said quietly. "That one leads to the source. You're not ready for that yet." "When will I be ready?" Thomas asked. "When you stop running from what you are and start running toward what you could become." She led him away from the marked door, down a corridor that seemed to stretch longer with each step they took. The walls here were covered with photographs, not framed pictures, but images that seemed to grow directly from the wallpaper like fungi. They showed moments from Thomas's life, but the chronology was wrong, shuffled like a deck of cards dropped on the floor. Here, Thomas at age 10, standing in the courtyard of the second school, but his reflection in a puddle showed him as he was now, marked and changed. There, Thomas at age 6, playing with Catherine in their mother's garden, but their mother's face was a blur, as if someone had tried to erase it but hadn't quite succeeded. And there, Thomas at an age he'd never reached, standing in the ruins of a city that looked like London but couldn't be, because the sky above it was full of stars arranged in patterns that spelled out words in the same ancient language the shadows had whispered in the East Wing. "And time doesn't work properly here," Elena explained, noticing his confusion. "Anassa, the house exists at the intersection of multiple realities. Past and future bleed together. Possibility becomes as real as actuality." They passed Marcus sitting in an alcove, whispering to himself in a voice so low it was barely audible. But the walls around him whispered back, amplifying his words into a chorus of overlapping conversations. "She's still down there, in the dark between the stones." The door was supposed to stay closed. I'm 7 years old, and I already knew I was a monster. "Oh, Catherine, why didn't you run faster?" And he's been like this since you arrived," Elena said. "Your presence in the house is stirring up memories in all of us, things we thought we'd buried are clawing their way back to the surface." They found Sarah in what might have been a library, surrounded by books that wrote themselves, their pages filling with text that appeared and disappeared like smoke. She looked up as they approached, and her eyes were full of radio static, white noise given form and purpose. "When I can hear her," as Sarah said without preamble, "on your sister. She's broadcasting on frequencies that don't exist, telling stories about the places between places, the rooms between rooms." "What is she saying?" Thomas asked. Sarah tilted her head, listening to voices only she could hear. "And she says the house is alive, but not in the way we understand life. It's alive the way a cancer is alive, growing by consuming other realities, other possibilities. We're not guests here, we're antibodies, the universe's attempt to fight off an infection." "And what are we supposed to do about it?" Thomas asked. "And that depends," Sarah replied, "and on whether you want to cure the infection or help it spread." Chapter 6. The Parliament of Selves. The house gathered them in what it called the spiral room, though Thomas was certain the room hadn't existed until the moment he'd needed to find it. The space was circular, with a domed ceiling that showed not the sky, but the swirling patterns of galaxies being born and dying in accelerated time. A spiral staircase descended from the center of the room into darkness, and around its circumference stood doors, dozens of them, each leading to a different version of reality. Thomas, Sarah, Marcus, and Elena stood at the 4 cardinal points of the room, as if the house had positioned them there for some purpose. In the center, where the spiral staircase began its descent, Catherine materialized, not the pale ghost from the nursery, but something more substantial, more present. She was still 5 years old, but her eyes held the weight of years, of knowledge gained through suffering. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated through the walls, through their bones, through the fabric of space itself. "The convergence is beginning," she said. "All the doors you've opened, all the boundaries you've crossed, all the rules you've broken, they've led to this moment." "But what convergence?" Thomas asked, though part of him already understood. A joining of worlds, Aunt Catherine replied, and in the place where all possibilities collapse into a single reality. You've been preparing for this your entire life, Thomas. Every school was a lesson, every trial a test. You're ready now. The doors around the room began to open simultaneously, revealing glimpses of other worlds, other realities. Thomas saw versions of himself in each doorway, some older, some younger, some barely recognizable as human. They stepped into the spiral room one by one, a parliament of selves gathering to make a decision that would reshape existence. One Thomas wore the robes of a headmaster, his eyes burning with the same fire Thomas had seen in the depths beneath Saltmere Academy. Another bore the scars of countless battles, leading an army of the transformed against entities that defied description. A third was bound in chains made of crystallized time, his mouth sealed shut because the words he might speak were too dangerous to be released. When we are the bridge, Catherine said, addressing all of them at once, on the point where the darkness can cross over into the light, or where the light can finally push back the darkness. The choice is ours. What happens if we choose wrong? Asked the battle-scarred Thomas. There is no wrong choice, Catherine replied, and only consequences. The darkness offers power, transformation, the ability to remake reality according to our will. The light offers redemption, healing, the chance to repair what was broken. And if we choose neither, and this from the chained Thomas, his words barely audible through his sealed lips, then the convergence happens without us, and we become observers to our own irrelevance. Thomas, the Thomas who had lived through the schools, who had survived the trials, who had finally remembered what he'd done, stepped forward. The other versions of himself watched with expressions ranging from hope to terror to resignation. I know what I have to choose, he said quietly. I've known since I first heard the whispers in the East Wing. And choose, Catherine said, and her form began to fade, becoming translucent once more. But remember, once you choose, there's no going back. The bridge, once built, cannot be unbuilt. The spiral staircase began to glow with an inner light that was neither warm nor cold, neither welcoming nor forbidding. It simply was, waiting for him to descend into whatever lay below. Thomas looked at his companions, Sarah with her static-filled eyes, Marcus with his shadow whispers, Elena with her translucent edges. They nodded, understanding passing between them without words. They had all been brought here for this moment, this choice, this convergence. He looked at the parliament of selves, at all the paths he might have taken, all the versions of himself he might have become. They watched him with expressions of perfect understanding, because they were him, and he was them, and the choice he made would be the choice they all made, across every reality, every possibility. Avoid doorways you don't remember opening, he whispered, remembering one of the house's rules. But he had opened this doorway, not just today, but 7 years ago, when he'd led Catherine into the East Wing and watched the shadows take her. Don't agree with voices that know you, he added. But Catherine's voice was his own voice, filtered through guilt and transformation and the weight of years. Never leave through the same door you entered, he concluded, and began his descent into the spiral. Chapter 7, The Architecture of Atonement. The spiral staircase descended through layers of reality, like geological strata of possibility. Each level showed Thomas a different version of the world, some where he'd never been born, some where Catherine had lived, some where the darkness had never stirred in the spaces between spaces. But as he descended, the variations began to converge, possibilities narrowing like the spiral itself, until there was only one path, one choice, one moment that all realities depended upon. At the bottom of the spiral lay a door. It was the same door from the East Wing of that first school, the door he'd watched Catherine touch 7 years ago. But now he understood what it truly was, not just a barrier between worlds, but a membrane, a point of contact where two incompatible realities touched without quite merging. The symbols carved into its surface pulsed with the rhythm of a vast heartbeat, and Thomas could hear whispers leaking through the gaps in the stone, not the voices of shadows. but the voices of those who had been taken, those who had been transformed, those who had been lost in the spaces between what was and what could be. Catherine's voice rose above the rest, no longer the ghost of a 5-year-old girl, but something older, something that had learned and grown during her time in the darkness. "I forgive you," she said, and the words hit Thomas like physical blows. "I've always forgiven you. The question is, can you forgive yourself?" Thomas placed his hand on the symbols and immediately felt the presence on the other side, vast, ancient, hungry. It had been feeding on guilt and regret, and the spaces between memories for millennia, growing stronger with each soul it consumed, each reality it infected. But it was also dying. The convergence wasn't just an invasion, it was a collapse. The entity had consumed so much that it was beginning to consume itself, reality folding inward like a dying star. "You can let it die," Catherine whispered, "and seal the door, accept the guilt, carry the weight of what you did. The darkness dies, but so do all the souls it's taken, including me." Thomas saw that path clearly, himself walking away from the door, the symbols fading, the whispers falling silent. The house would crumble, his companions would return to their normal lives, scarred but alive. The world would be safe but incomplete, missing all those who had been lost to the spaces between. "When you can open it," Catherine continued. "Let everything through at once, the darkness and the light, the consumed and the consumers, the lost and the found. Chaos, but also possibility. Destruction, but also rebirth." That path was chaos incarnate, realities bleeding together, the laws of physics becoming suggestions, the boundaries between life and death, sanity and madness, self and other dissolving entirely. Some would thrive in such a world, others would be destroyed by it. There was no way to predict which. Catherine said, and her voice carried a note Thomas had never heard before. "Hope, and you can become the bridge yourself. Hold the door open just enough to let the lost souls through, but not the entity that took them. Bear the weight of that choice. Carry the responsibility of that decision, for as long as necessary." Thomas saw that path too, and it was the hardest of all. He would become the living seal, the conscious barrier between worlds. The entity would rage against his will for centuries, possibly millennia, trying to break through. He would age, but never die. Conscious and aware of his burden, but unable to set it down. But the souls would be free. Catherine would be free. All those who had been lost in the spaces between could find their way home. "That's not a choice," Thomas said quietly. "That's a punishment." No," Catherine replied, and her form began to solidify, becoming real in a way she hadn't been since her death. "That's atonement. That's taking responsibility. That's growing up." Thomas looked at the door, at the symbols that pulsed with otherworldly light, at the darkness that pressed against the barrier between worlds. He thought of all the children who had been taken, all the souls who had been lost, all the realities that had been consumed. He thought of his companions above, Sarah, Marcus, Elena, and all the others like them, scattered across the world, marked and changed, but still fighting to preserve what was good and bright and worth saving. He thought of his sister, 5 years old and trusting, following him into the darkness because she believed he would keep her safe. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Oh no, I know," she replied. Thomas opened the door. Chapter 8, The Weight of Doors. Light exploded through the opening, not the clean light of day, but something older, more primal, the light that had existed before stars learned to burn. It poured through Thomas, around him, transforming him even as he held the door steady against the pressure of realities trying to merge. The entity on the other side roared its fury, a sound that existed in too many dimensions for human ears to process. It pressed against the opening, trying to force its way through, but Thomas held firm, his will become a living barrier. Through the light came the souls, dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of them. Children who had wandered into places they shouldn't have gone, adults who had looked too deeply into mirrors that showed too much, entire populations that had vanished when their reality had been consumed from within. Catherine was among them, but not the Catherine he remembered. This version had grown during her time in the darkness, learned things no 5-year-old should know, become something that was still his sister but also something more. She paused as she passed through the door, placing a hand that was both warm and cold on his cheek. "You can let go now," she said. "You've done enough." "And if I let go, it comes through," Thomas replied, gritting his teeth against the pressure. "All of it. The entity, the consumed realities, everything." "Not if you trust us," Catherine said, and Thomas saw that the other souls weren't just fleeing. They were positioning themselves, forming a living net around the entity, holding it back through their collective will. "We've learned things in the darkness, Thomas. We know how to fight it now." "But you need someone on this side," Thomas said, understanding, "and someone to anchor the barrier." "And not forever," Catherine said, "and just long enough for us to bind it properly. A few years, maybe decades. Then you can rest." Thomas felt the weight of the choice settling on his shoulders like a mantle made of lead and starlight. Behind him, he could hear his companions from the house, Sarah, Marcus, Elena, adding their voices to his, their will to his will, their strength to his strength. The house itself was helping, its impossible architecture bending reality around the door, creating space for the transformation that was taking place. Walls became permeable, floors became sky, ceiling became depth. The hollow house was revealing its true nature, not a shelter for the lost, but a nexus point, a place where multiple realities touched and could be shaped by sufficient will. The entity's roar became a whine, then a whisper, as the returned souls wrapped it in chains made of memory and forgiveness. Guilt transformed into purpose, loss transformed into determination. It fought, but it was outnumbered now, weakened by its own gluttony, unable to consume what freely offered itself to be consumed. Thomas felt the pressure on the door lessen, the terrible weight of worlds pressing against worlds beginning to ease. The light streaming through began to dim, not from failure but from completion. The emergency passage was no longer needed. "It's done," Catherine said, and her voice carried the weariness of battles fought across multiple realities. "Entity is bound. The consumed realities are being restored. The lost souls are finding their way home." "And us?" Thomas asked. "What happens to us?" Catherine smiled, and for a moment she was 5 years old again, bright and trusting and full of love for her older brother. "And that we get to choose," she said. "And for the first time in either of our lives, we get to choose what comes next." Chapter 9. The Grammar of Becoming. The door began to close, not from Thomas's will but from its own nature. The emergency was over, the crisis passed, and reality was reasserting its boundaries. But as it sealed, Thomas felt something change within himself, a fundamental alteration that went deeper than the transformations he'd undergone at the schools. He was no longer just Thomas Blackwood, orphan boy with guilt-stained hands. He was also the bridge, the guardian, the one who held the spaces between spaces in trust for those who might need them. The entity was bound but not destroyed. It would always exist in the margins, in the gaps between thoughts, in the moments between heartbeats, and Thomas would always be aware of it, always ready to stand between it and the world it hungered to consume. But that awareness came with unexpected gifts. He could see the connections now, the threads that linked every person to every other person, the patterns that governed not just human behavior but the behavior of reality itself. He could sense other guardians scattered across the world, other bridges built from human will and inhuman necessity. Sarah emerged from the static that had surrounded her since the convergence began, her form solid and real for the first time in years. The radio frequencies that had haunted her had been absorbed into the greater symphony of existence, and now she could hear not just the voices of the dead, but the songs of the living, the music that held the world together. "I can hear them all," she said wonderingly. "Every voice that was ever silenced, every word that was ever lost. They're still there, still speaking, still trying to be heard." Marcus straightened, and when he spoke, his voice was clear and strong, no longer the whisper it had been. The walls no longer echoed his words because he no longer needed them to. His voice had found its own strength, its own authority. "The mirrors," he said, "and they're showing truth now, not lies. I can see myself clearly for the first time since the plague." Elena flickered once, twice, then solidified completely, her translucent edges becoming firm and real. The partial displacement that had defined her existence was resolved. She was fully present in this reality now, no longer caught between life and death. "I remember now," she said, "and what I saw during those 4 minutes. It wasn't death, it was possibility. All the worlds that could be, all the choices that could be made. I was meant to come back and help choose." The hollow house began to change around them, its impossible architecture settling into something more stable, more permanent. The rooms stopped rearranging themselves, the corridors ceased their endless loops, the doors opened onto spaces that made sense in the context of three-dimensional reality. But it remained a nexus point, a place where those marked by contact with the spaces between could find refuge and purpose. Others would come. There were always others, always those who had seen too much or lost too much or been changed too much to fit comfortably in the normal world. "And this is our responsibility now," Thomas said, understanding flooding through him like dawn breaking over a long night. "And be the bridge between what was and what could be, to help others who've been touched by the darkness find their way back to the light. Or forward to something new," Catherine added. She had chosen to remain partially in both worlds, appearing sometimes as the child she had been, sometimes as the woman she might have become, sometimes as something that transcended both possibilities. "Not everyone wants to go back, Thomas. Some want to go through." Chapter 10, The Cartography of Consequence. In the days that followed, though time moved strangely in the hollow house, and days might have been weeks or moments, they began to understand the scope of what had changed. The entity's binding had sent ripples through all the realities it had touched, all the worlds it had partially consumed. Some snapped back to their original forms like rubber bands released from tension. Others remained altered, but in ways that allowed for growth rather than destruction. A few chose to merge with neighboring realities, creating hybrid worlds where magic and mundane coexisted in new configurations. Thomas found himself able to perceive these changes, to map the new geography of possibility that spread out from the hollow house like roots from a tree. Each reality had its own guardians now, some human, some not, all committed to maintaining the delicate balance between order and chaos, between the known and the unknowable. Sarah established what she called the Archive of Whispers, a library where the voices of the lost could be preserved and studied. She could hear them all now, every word that had ever been spoken in fear or hope or love, every song that had ever been silenced, every story that had ever been forgotten. The archive became a place where researchers and scholars could come to understand the true history of the world, the events that had been erased or altered by the entity's hunger. Marcus created the Mirror Garden, a space where reflections told the truth rather than lies, where people could come to see themselves clearly, without the distortions of fear or self-deception. The mirrors showed not just physical appearance, but emotional reality, psychological truth, the connections between people that were invisible to normal sight. Elena founded the Threshold Clinic, where those who had been partially displaced by contact with otherworldly forces could find healing and integration. She understood better than anyone what it meant to exist between states, and her own hard-won stability became a beacon for others struggling with similar displacement. Catherine chose a different path entirely. She became the keeper of doors, responsible for monitoring the barriers between realities, ensuring that nothing like the entity could ever again gain the foothold necessary for wholesale consumption of worlds. She existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, her consciousness spread across the spaces between spaces, alert for any sign of new threats. And Thomas became the bridge itself, the living connection between all these efforts, the consciousness that coordinated the work of maintaining reality's stability. He could feel every guardian, every protected soul, every preserved world as if they were extensions of his own being. It was not the life he had imagined for himself as a 7-year-old boy playing hide-and-seek with his sister, but it was the life he had chosen, the responsibility he had accepted, the atonement he had embraced. Chapter 11. The Ecology of Memory. Weeks passed, or perhaps months. Time had become fluid in the hollow house, bending around the needs of its inhabitants and their work. Thomas found himself settling into routines that would have seemed impossible during his school years, monitoring the stability of dimensional barriers. Before breakfast, counseling newly arrived refugees from consumed realities over lunch, coordinating with other guardians across multiple worlds before dinner. The house filled with others like them, people who had been marked by contact with the spaces between, who had survived trials that changed them fundamentally, who could no longer fit comfortably in the normal world but had found purpose in protecting it. There was Maya Chen, who had been trapped in a time loop for subjective decades and emerged with the ability to see the probability streams that governed future events. She worked with Catherine to predict and prevent potential breaches in the barriers between worlds. There was David Okafor, who had been possessed by an entity from the spaces between mathematics and had retained the ability to perceive the numerical relationships that underpinned reality. He helped Sarah organize the archive according to principles that existed outside normal logic. There was Rebecca Walsh, who had died and been resurrected so many times that death had become merely another state of being for her. She worked with Elena at the Threshold Clinic, helping others navigate the boundaries between life and death, sanity and madness, self and other. Each new arrival brought stories of their own trials, their own transformations, their own hard-won understanding of the forces that shaped reality from behind the scenes. The Hollow House became not just a refuge but a university, a research center, a military base, and a hospital all in one. But it was also, Thomas realized, a family. The bonds formed by shared trauma and common purpose ran deeper than blood, stronger than time. They had all lost their original families, their original selves, their original places in the world. But they had found something new, something that might be even more precious for being chosen rather than inherited. One evening, as Thomas stood in the garden that had grown around the house, a garden where plants from dozens of realities bloomed in impossible combinations, Catherine appeared beside him, flickering between her child self and something older, wiser, sadder. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "The choice you made? The responsibility you accepted?" Thomas considered the question seriously. Did he regret becoming the bridge? Did he miss the possibility of a normal life, of growing up and growing old in the usual human fashion? "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally, "and I regret that you had to die for me to understand what I was capable of. I regret that so many others had to suffer for the entity to be stopped. But the choice itself? No, I don't regret that. Even though it means you can never really rest, never really be just Thomas Blackwood, ordinary person with ordinary problems." Thomas smiled and felt the weight of all the connections he maintained, all the responsibilities he had accepted, all the lives he helped protect. It was a heavy weight, but it was also a privilege. "And I was never going to be ordinary," he said. "Not after what I did, not after what I saw. At least this way the weight means something. At least this way it helps." Catherine nodded, understanding passing between them, without need for words. They stood together in the impossible garden, brother and sister reunited across death and transformation, watching over a world that would never fully understand what they had sacrificed to keep it safe. Chapter 12. The Democracy of Doors Revisited. As Thomas's first year as the bridge drew to a close, though year was an approximation in a place where time bent around necessity rather than flowing in straight lines, he began to understand the true scope of the network he had become part of. There were other houses scattered across the world, other nexus points where realities touched and could be monitored and protected. Each had its own guardian, its own community of the marked and transformed, its own methods of maintaining the delicate balance between order and chaos. The ebony sanctum in what had once been Cairo served those marked by encounters with entities from the spaces between death and dreams. The Crystal Observatory in the mountains of Tibet monitored threats from the mathematical dimensions, where abstract concepts took on concrete form and purpose. The singing spires of Antarctica, visible only to those who had learned to see beyond the 3 dimensions of normal space, coordinated efforts across realities where music and mathematics were the same thing. Thomas could feel them all, sense the work being done by guardians whose names he might never know, but whose dedication he could perceive as clearly as his own heartbeat. They were connected not by technology or magic, but by shared purpose, by the recognition that some responsibilities transcended individual desires or needs. But connection brought its own challenges. One night, as Thomas monitored the dimensional barriers around the hollow house, he felt a disturbance in the network, not a breach, but a disagreement, a conflict of wills that threatened to disrupt the careful balance they had all worked to maintain. The Crystal Observatory was detecting mathematical anomalies that suggested a new entity was forming in the spaces between prime numbers and perfect squares. The singing spires were registering harmonic distortions that indicated something was feeding on the resonance frequencies that held certain realities together. The Ebony Sanctum was reporting dreams that predicted the return of something that had been thought permanently banished. Different guardians proposed different solutions. Some wanted to take immediate action, to strike before the threat could fully manifest. Others argued for patience, for allowing the situation to develop until they could understand its true nature. Still others suggested that intervention might make the problem worse, that some threats were best left alone until they resolved themselves or proved to be manageable. Thomas found himself in the position of mediator, his role as the bridge making him the natural coordinator for the network's response. It was a responsibility he had not anticipated, and one that forced him to consider perspectives and possibilities he might never have imagined on his own. "The democracy of doors," Catherine said, appearing beside him as he wrestled with the decision. "In every choice opens some possibilities and closes others. Every action has consequences that ripple across multiple realities. The weight of being right is nothing compared to the weight of being wrong." "So what do I do?" Thomas asked. "How do I choose when every choice could be catastrophic?" "And you don't choose alone," Catherine replied. "That's the point of the network, the purpose of the connections. You gather information, you consult with others, you make the best decision you can with the knowledge available. And then you accept responsibility for the consequences, whatever they might be." Thomas reached out through the network, his consciousness touching the minds of guardians around the world. He shared what he knew, listened to their perspectives, weighed their arguments against his own understanding of the forces at work. Slowly, a consensus emerged. The threat was real but not immediate. Action was necessary but not precipitous. They would monitor, investigate, prepare, and when the time came to act, they would act together. Their combined will focused on preventing another convergence like the one that had nearly consumed reality itself. The decision made, Thomas felt the network settle into a new configuration, resources and attention flowing toward the emerging threat, while maintaining vigilance against other potential problems. It was a delicate balance, requiring constant adjustment and readjustment, but it held. This is what it means to be the bridge, he realized. Not just to hold open doorways between worlds, but to help coordinate the efforts of those who guard those doorways. To be the point where information converges and decisions are made. It was a heavier responsibility than he had imagined, but also a more meaningful one. He was not just protecting reality, he was helping to guide its evolution, to shape the direction of its growth and development. Epilogue, the wallpaper speaks. 5 years later, or perhaps 50, or perhaps 5 minutes, time having long since ceased to follow normal rules in the hollow house. Thomas stood again in the corridor where his story had begun, his palm pressed against wallpaper that breathed with the rhythm of sleeping worlds. The house had grown around him, adding rooms and corridors as needed to accommodate new arrivals, new purposes, new connections to the ever-expanding network of guardians and protected spaces. What had once been a refuge had become a small city, a center of learning and coordination that served realities far beyond the one where it had originally taken root. Thomas himself had changed as well, though in ways that were not immediately visible. He looked older, not aged exactly, but weathered, marked by years of bearing responsibility for forces beyond normal human comprehension. His eyes held depths that reflected not just the room around him, but the infinite spaces between rooms, the endless possibilities that existed in the margins of reality. Behind the wallpaper, he could feel the words that had been written there during the house's construction, the message that had been waiting for him to find it. You are not the last. You are the bridge. But now he understood what those words truly meant. He was not the last guardian, not the final protection against the forces that threatened reality's stability. He was the bridge between the old ways and the new, between the chaotic time when entities could consume entire realities unopposed and the emerging era when such threats would be met by coordinated resistance from those who had learned to work together across the boundaries of individual worlds. The network now spanned dozens of realities, hundreds of guardian posts, thousands of individuals who had been marked by contact with the forces that existed in the spaces between spaces. They were no longer isolated, no longer struggling alone against incomprehensible threats. They were connected, coordinated, capable of responses that individual guardians could never have managed. New schools still appeared from time to time, institutions designed to test and transform those who might become guardians themselves. But they were different now, less cruel, more purposeful. The arbitrary trials and psychological tortures of Thomas's own education had been replaced by training programs that prepared candidates for the realities they would face while respecting their humanity and individual worth. Some still broke under the pressure, still proved unable to bear the weight of guardian responsibilities. But they were not abandoned, not left to face their trauma alone. The network had developed systems for helping those who could not become guardians find other ways to contribute, other roles that matched their abilities and limitations. Catherine appeared beside him, as she often did when he needed to remember why the work mattered. She looked as she had in life now more often than not, a 5-year-old girl with bright eyes and a ready smile, untouched by the darkness that had claimed her except for a wisdom that went deeper than her apparent years. "Any regrets?" she asked, the question that had become their ritual greeting over the years. "And only that it took so long to understand what was possible," It.Thomas replied, giving his standard answer, "and that so many had to suffer while we learned." But we did learn," Catherine said, "and now others won't have to go through what we went through, at least not alone." "Oh," Thomas nodded, feeling the truth of that statement resonate through the network, through all the connections he maintained and nurtured. The work was far from over, might never be over, as long as reality itself continued to evolve and change, but it was no longer impossible, no longer hopeless. He was the bridge, but he was not alone. None of them were alone, not anymore. In the distance, he could hear new arrivals being welcomed to the hollow house, could sense new connections forming as they were introduced to the network, could feel the pattern of protection and coordination growing stronger and more complex with each addition. The wallpaper continued to breathe beneath his palm, and in its rhythm, he could hear the heartbeat of all the worlds that had been saved, all the realities that had been preserved, all the souls that had been protected by the choices he and the others had made. It was enough. More than enough. It was home. Behind the wallpaper, you are not the last. You are the bridge. And the message had always been there, waiting for him to understand what it meant. Now finally he did. The bridge was built. The network was strong. The future, for all its uncertainties, was full of possibility, with Thomas Blackwood, no longer just an orphan boy with guilt-stained hands, but the living connection between what was and what could be, stood ready to face whatever came next. Chapter 4 of the Blackwood Archives. The invitation arrived on paper that smelled of smoke and old ceremonies. Thomas found it slipped beneath his door at the boarding house where he'd been staying since Uncle Harold's funeral, though he couldn't quite remember the funeral itself. only the weight of earth on wood and the way the mourners had avoided looking at him directly. The envelope bore no postmark, no return address, just his name written in script that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at it. Thomas Blackwood became Marcus Holloway, became something else entirely, letters rearranging themselves like living things. Inside, cream-colored paper with words that burned themselves into his vision. Monch, you are cordially invited to participate in the trials of the Crimson Flame at Greysteel Manor. Your presence is required for the completion of certain ancestral obligations. Transport will be provided at midnight from the crossroads where three paths meet. Come alone, come willing. The fourth trial awaits. The Keepers of the Ancient Way. Thomas read it 3 times, each reading revealing details that hadn't been there before. A map appeared in the margins, showing winding roads that led deep into woods he'd never seen but somehow remembered. At the bottom, in smaller script, "A few have been here before, though not as yourself." The paper was warm to the touch, almost feverish, and when he held it up to the light, he could see watermarks that looked disturbingly like anatomical drawings. Hearts and lungs and branching neural networks that pulsed gently, as if alive. He should have thrown it away, should have dismissed it as an elaborate prank or the product of a mind still fractured from his experiences at Fogmore. But Thomas had learned to pay attention to impossibilities, had come to understand that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than normal people believed. And there was something about the phrase ancestral obligations that resonated in his bones like a struck tuning fork. At 11:30 that night, Thomas found himself walking through the village toward the crossroads, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name or resist. The moon was dark, and the streets were empty except for cats that watched him with 2 knowing eyes and scattered when he tried to meet their gaze. The crossroads stood at the edge of the village proper, where the main road split into 3 paths, one leading back toward civilization, one winding up into the hills, and one disappearing into woods so thick and dark they seemed to swallow light itself. At the center, where the paths met, stood an ancient stone marker carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. As midnight struck on the church bell, though the church had been demolished months ago, a carriage materialized from the darkness. It was something out of a Gothic novel, all black wood and iron fittings, drawn by horses that steamed in the cool air and whose eyes reflected no light. The driver was a figure in a hooded cloak who said nothing, merely gestured for Thomas to climb aboard. The interior of the carriage was lined with deep red velvet that felt like skin under his fingers. As soon as he settled into the seat, the carriage lurched into motion, wheels clattering over cobblestones that shouldn't have existed on the modern road. Through the window, Thomas watched the familiar countryside transform. Fields became forests, modern houses faded into mist, and the very air seemed to thicken with age and intention. Time moved strangely. Sometimes the journey felt endless, sometimes like mere moments, as if the carriage existed in pockets of temporal distortion. Finally, they stopped. Greysteel Manor rose from the darkness like a fever dream made manifest. It was enormous, a sprawling Gothic structure that seemed to have been built without any coherent plan, as if rooms and towers and wings had been added over centuries according to the whims of mad architects. Spires twisted toward the sky like gnarled fingers, and windows gleamed with inner light that cast no shadows. The most unsettling thing was how it moved. Not obviously. Thomas had to watch for several minutes before he was sure, but the building was subtly shifting, walls sliding, almost imperceptibly, windows blinking open and closed like sleepy eyes, architectural features rearranging themselves when no one was looking directly at them. The driver gestured for him to dismount, then disappeared along with the carriage, leaving Thomas alone before the massive front doors. They were carved with the same symbols as the crossroads marker, and as he approached, they swung open without a sound. The entrance hall was vast, lit by candles that burned with crimson flames and cast everything in shades of blood and shadow. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above, and the walls were lined with portraits of people in elaborate period clothing, all watching him with painted eyes that seemed to track his movement. Thomas Blackwood, said a voice from the shadows. A figure stepped forward, tall, elegant, wearing robes that seemed to be cut from midnight itself. The face was androgynous and ageless, with features that were beautiful in the way that sharp things are beautiful, and eyes that held depths Thomas didn't want to explore. "I am the first keeper," the figure said. "You are expected." Expected for what? The trials, of course, the completion of what was begun long ago. The first keeper smiled, and Thomas saw that their teeth were perfect white, each one carved with tiny symbols that glowed faintly in the candlelight. "Though I suspect you already know that, don't you? Somewhere in the depths of inherited memory." Thomas did know, though he couldn't say how. The knowledge sat in his chest like a weight, heavy and familiar and terrifying. What kind of trials? The kind that separate the real from the remembered, the born from the conjured, the kind that reveal what you truly are beneath the borrowed names and stolen faces. The first keeper turned and began walking deeper into the manor. "Come, the others are waiting." Thomas followed, though every instinct screamed at him to run. The hallways of Greysteel Manor defied physics and reason. Corridors that should have led to dead ends opened onto vast chambers. Staircases descended in impossible directions, and doors sometimes opened onto rooms that were clearly larger than the building that contained them. They passed other figures in the halls, all wearing similar robes, all watching Thomas with expressions of anticipation mixed with something that might have been pity. None of them spoke, but he could hear whispers echoing from the walls themselves, as if the building was alive and commenting on his passage. "How many have done this before?" Thomas asked. "The trials?" "Oh, countless numbers." Though whether they were all different people, or various iterations of the same consciousness, is a matter of some philosophical debate. The first keeper paused before a door marked with the number 3. Each trial reveals another layer of truth. Some candidates discover they were never real to begin with. Others learn that reality itself is more fluid than they believed. They entered a circular chamber lit by braziers that burned with that same crimson flame. 7 other figures in robes stood arranged around the room's perimeter, and in the center was a complex geometric pattern carved into the stone floor, inlaid with what looked disturbingly like bone, and filled with dark liquid that might have been ink or blood. "The third trial," the first keeper announced, "as you have completed the first 2. "I haven't completed anything," Thomas protested. "I've never been here before." Several of the robed figures chuckled, the sound echoing strangely in the chamber. One of them stepped forward, pulling back his hood to reveal a face that was familiar yet wrong, like looking at his reflection in funhouse mirrors. "Haven't you?" the figure asked, and Thomas recognized his own voice, though distorted. "What about the school in the moors, the chamber beneath the coastal academy? Were those not trials of their own?" Memory hit him like a physical blow. The stone voice at Eildor Hollow, calling him by a name he'd never heard but somehow recognized. The descent into the breathing chamber, where something had marked him with blood and whispered about falling twice. Each experience had felt like a test, a challenge that revealed more about his nature than about the places themselves. "The first trial was recognition," another figure said. "This one with Thomas's face, but older, scarred across one cheek, learning that you were called by names you have never worn." "The second was descent," said a third, youngest looking of the group, "discovering that some depths called to you because you have been there before." "And now," the first keeper said, "in a third trial, reflection. You must see yourself as you truly are, not as you remember being." The chamber began to change around them. The walls stretched upward, becoming a cylindrical tower that rose into darkness. Mirrors materialized from the stone, hundreds of them, covering every surface until Thomas was surrounded by infinite reflections of himself. But the reflections were wrong. Some showed him older, some younger. Some showed him in different clothes, different times, different places. Some showed him as Marcus Holloway, strapped to the asylum bed with electrodes attached to his skull. Others showed him as people he'd never been. A woman in Victorian dress, a child in medieval robes, an elderly man with eyes like burning coals. "What am I seeing?" "Truth," the first keeper said. "Every face you have worn, Every life you have borrowed, every identity you have tried on like costumes. You are not Thomas Blackwood, as you have finally learned. But you are not Marcus Holloway either. You are something older and stranger, a pattern that repeats across time, a consciousness that refuses to be contained within the boundaries of singular existence. One of the mirrors showed something that made Thomas's breath catch. He saw himself, unmistakably himself, standing in this very chamber, but the scene was different. The robed figures were gone, replaced by people in period clothing from various eras. Medieval nobles, Victorian gentlemen, Edwardian ladies, all watching as his reflection performed some kind of ritual at the center of the carved pattern. "When was this?" he whispered. "When wasn't it?" the first keeper replied. "You have been conducting these trials for centuries, Thomas, who is not Thomas. Sometimes as the candidate, sometimes as the keeper, sometimes as something else entirely. Each iteration teaches you more about your nature, but also fractures you further." Another mirror showed him in the asylum, but not as Marcus Holloway. This version wore doctor's clothing and was observing patients with the same clinical detachment he'd seen in Dr. Aldrich. In the reflection, he was taking notes while a young man, someone who looked disturbingly like himself, screamed under the influence of electroshock therapy. "No," Thomas said, backing away from the mirrors. "I'm not. I would never. Wouldn't you?" The first keeper moved closer, and Thomas could see his own face reflected in their two bright eyes. "You have worn so many faces, played so many roles. Victim and victimizer, patient and doctor, student and teacher. The pattern repeats because you make it repeat, because some part of you needs to understand every angle of the experience." The mirrors began to move, rotating around the chamber like a massive kaleidoscope. The images blurred together, hundreds of lives, thousands of moments, all featuring variations of himself in different roles, different times, different realities. And through it all, one constant, the same pattern of discovery, horror, and transformation. "But that's not possible," Thomas said, though even as he spoke, he could feel the truth of it settling into his bones. "No one can live that many lives." "No one human," agreed the first keeper. "But you stopped being human long ago, didn't you? You became something else, a recurring motif in the symphony of existence, a glitch in the pattern of reality that refuses to be debugged." The mirrors stopped spinning, and Thomas found himself facing a single reflection that showed the chamber as it truly was. But he wasn't alone in the image. Standing behind him, transparent but undeniably present, were dozens of other versions of himself, all the lives he'd lived, all the faces he'd worn, all the names he'd answered to. And at the center of them all, barely visible like a negative image burned into film, was something else. Something that might have been his original form, before the centuries of borrowing and becoming and changing had worn away whatever he'd once been. It was barely human, more concept than flesh, a writhing mass of possibility and potential that existed in the spaces between definite states. Looking at it made his mind recoil, but it was undeniably him, the core of what he was beneath all the borrowed identities. "This is what the asylum doctors were trying to treat," the first keeper explained. "Not mental illness, but something that transcended the very concept of individual consciousness. They couldn't cure you because you weren't sick. You were evolved beyond their understanding." Thomas stared at the reflection of his true form, feeling a mixture of horror and recognition. "What am I?" "You are what happens when consciousness refuses to be contained, when the boundary between self and other becomes meaningless, when the need to understand becomes so powerful that it reshapes reality to accommodate that need." The mirror images began to fade, leaving only the normal reflection. Thomas as he appeared in this moment, in this borrowed body, wearing this stolen name. But now he could see the truth behind the facade, could perceive the vast network of experiences and identities that comprised his actual existence. "The third trial is complete," the first keeper announced. "You have seen yourself as you truly are. Now comes the choice. Do you wish to continue to the fourth trial?" "You said the fourth trial doesn't exist." The first keeper smiled that terrible, perfect smile. The fourth trial doesn't exist for those who are still bound by linear thinking, by the assumption that trials follow numerical order and logical progression. But you have moved beyond such limitations, haven't you? The chamber began to shift again, walls flowing like water, ceiling dissolving into star-filled darkness. The carved pattern in the floor began to glow, lines of force spreading outward like neural pathways connecting to similar patterns that appeared throughout the space. The fourth trial is the trial of origin, the first keeper continued, where you discover not just what you are, but why you became what you are. What drove you to fragment yourself across centuries, to experience existence from every possible angle? And if I refuse, then you return to the borrowed life of Thomas Blackwood, knowing the truth but unable to act on it. You remain fractured, incomplete, forever searching for something you can never find because you've forgotten what you're looking for. Thomas looked around the transformed chamber, at the robed figures who wore his face, at the patterns of light that pulsed like heartbeats, at the infinite darkness above that seemed to call to something deep in his core. He thought of the asylum, of the schools where impossible things had whispered his forgotten names, of all the lives he'd lived and lost and borrowed and abandoned. He thought of the sleepless one, who had tried to warn him about the nature of his existence, and of Uncle Harold, who had watched over one fragment of his scattered consciousness with desperate protective care. "If I continue," he said slowly, "what happens to Thomas Blackwood?" "Thomas Blackwood was never real," the first keeper replied gently. "He was just another mask you wore, another role you played. But the experiences you had as Thomas, the growth and change and understanding, those become part of the larger pattern. Nothing is lost. And Marcus Holloway, also just a role, a way of experiencing madness and treatment and institutional cruelty from the inside, necessary data for the larger experiment." "What experiment?" The first keeper's expression became almost sad. "The experiment of being human, of understanding what it means to exist within the constraints of mortality and individual consciousness. You began it long ago, when you first encountered something that made you question the nature of reality itself." Images flashed through Thomas's mind, not memories exactly, but impressions of vast age and cosmic curiosity. He saw himself as something else entirely, something that existed outside time and space, observing the strange phenomenon of human consciousness with scientific fascination. And then something had gone wrong, or right, depending on perspective. Instead of merely observing, he had become invested, had wanted to understand, not just intellectually but experientially, had chosen to fragment himself into human-shaped pieces so he could live within the constraints he was studying. "I volunteered for this," he whispered. "You designed it," the first keeper corrected. "The entire system, the schools, the asylum, the trials, all of it. A comprehensive laboratory for exploring the full spectrum of human experience. And yourself as both researcher and subject." The truth of it hit him like a revelation and a condemnation simultaneously. Every trauma he'd experienced, every moment of fear and confusion and loss, he'd orchestrated it all, not from cruelty, but from a cosmic being's attempt to understand the beautiful, terrible complexity of mortal existence. "The students who disappeared at Eildor Hollow," he said, pieces clicking into place. "The patients at Fogmore. Were they real? As real as you are? Which is to say, real enough for the purposes of the experiment. Some were fragments of yourself experiencing different aspects of the human condition. Others were," the first keeper paused, "collateral damage. Beings who got caught up in the reality distortions your presence creates." Thomas felt something break inside him, some last vestige of the identity he'd constructed as Thomas Blackwood. The weight of countless lives, countless experiences of suffering and joy, and everything in between, settled onto his shoulders like a mantle made of lead. "How do I stop it?" "You can't. The experiment has taken on a life of its own, created recursive loops and self-perpetuating cycles, but you can choose to experience it consciously, rather than as a series of confused fragments. You can become whole again, integrate all the scattered pieces of yourself. And then you become what you were always meant to be, a bridge between the cosmic and the human, between the infinite and the finite. You stop being scattered fragments living borrowed lives and become the complete pattern, experiencing all possibilities simultaneously. The chamber around them was transforming again, becoming something that existed beyond three-dimensional space. Thomas could see, feel, know the vast network of connections that comprised his true existence, threads of experience and memory stretching across centuries, connecting every life he'd lived, every identity he'd worn, every moment of consciousness he'd experienced. It was beautiful and terrible and completely overwhelming. "I'm not ready," he said. "You never will be," the first keeper replied. "Readiness is a human concept, and you are preparing to transcend humanity itself. But you can choose to face it consciously, or continue fragmenting until there's nothing left but scattered echoes of what you once were." Thomas closed his eyes and felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. He could return to the simple, limited existence of Thomas Blackwood, carrying the burden of terrible knowledge but at least maintaining some semblance of individual identity, or he could step forward into the fourth trial and discover what lay beyond the boundaries of human consciousness. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the chamber. He stood in a vast library that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions, its shelves reaching up into misty darkness above. Every book contained one of his lives, one of his experiences, one fragment of the vast experiment he had designed and forgotten and rediscovered countless times. At the center of the library stood a pedestal holding a single volume bound in leather that looked disturbingly organic. The cover bore no title, just the same symbols that had marked the invitation: the crossroads stone, the doors of Greysteel Manor. "The fourth trial," he said to the empty air, knowing somehow that this was what he had been moving toward through all the previous experiences. The trial that doesn't exist. He approached the pedestal slowly, every step echoing in the infinite space. The book seemed to pulse gently, as if it contained a heartbeat rather than pages. When he was close enough to touch it, words appeared on the cover in script that burned itself into his vision. "A true history of what you were before you chose to forget." Thomas hesitated, his hand hovering over the book. Opening it would mean the end of any pretense of being human, of being individual, of being anything other than what he truly was. But not opening it would mean remaining trapped in the cycle of fragmentation and confusion, living borrowed lives and experiencing repeated trauma without understanding or purpose. He opened the book. The first page contained a single line, "And you opened this in the beginning." And suddenly, he remembered. He remembered being something vast and curious, existing in spaces between dimensions, observing the strange phenomenon of biological consciousness with academic fascination. He remembered the moment when observation became investment, when intellectual curiosity became emotional connection. He remembered the decision to fragment himself, to experience mortality from the inside, to understand what it meant to live within the constraints of time and flesh and individual identity. It had been meant as a temporary experiment, a brief exploration of a fascinating anomaly in the cosmic order. But something had gone wrong. The fragments had become lost, confused, unable to remember their origin or purpose. They had begun creating their own realities, their own explanations for the strange experiences that resulted from their true nature. The experiment had become a prison, and the researcher had become lost in his own research. The schools, the asylum, the manor, all of it had been created by his unconscious need to understand and integrate his scattered experiences. Reality had bent around his fragmented consciousness, creating spaces where the impossible could occur, where the boundaries between different aspects of his nature could interact and influence each other. Thomas Blackwood, Marcus Holloway, all the other identities, they were roles he had played in an elaborate performance whose purpose he had forgotten. But the experiences had been real, the growth and change and understanding genuine. Nothing was wasted, nothing was lost. He turned the page and saw an image that made his breath catch. It was himself as he truly was, not the barely human thing he'd glimpsed in the mirrors, but his original form, beautiful and terrible and completely alien, a being of pure consciousness that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. But it was alone, utterly, completely alone, in a way that mortal minds couldn't comprehend. And that loneliness had driven him to fragment himself, to experience connection and relationship and all the messy, painful, wonderful complexity of social existence. The final page contained instructions written in his own handwriting, though he had no memory of writing them. When you remember what you are, you will face a choice. You can reintegrate completely, returning to your original state of cosmic solitude. Or you can choose to remain fragmented but conscious, experiencing existence from multiple perspectives simultaneously while retaining awareness of your true nature. Choose carefully. This choice, unlike the others, cannot be undone. Thomas closed the book and found himself back in the circular chamber, surrounded by the robed figures who wore his face. But now he could see them clearly. They weren't separate beings but aspects of himself, different facets of his consciousness that had taken on semi-independent existence. "You remember," the first keeper said, and Thomas could hear his own voice beneath the distortion. "I remember." Thomas looked around at his other selves, at the patterns of light that connected them, at the infinite complexity of what he had become. "But I don't want to be alone again." "Then you choose fragmentation with consciousness?" "I choose integration with multiplicity," Thomas said, the words coming from some deep understanding he hadn't known he possessed. "I choose to be whole while remaining many." The chamber began to dissolve around them, reality reshaping itself according to his will and understanding. The robed figures stepped forward one by one, merging with Thomas not as separate entities rejoining, but as aspects of a single consciousness acknowledging its own complexity. He felt himself expanding, becoming larger and more complete while somehow remaining recognizably himself. The memories and experiences of countless lives integrated into a vast, coherent whole. He was Thomas Blackwood, the curious student, Marcus Holloway, the broken patient, the Victorian doctor studying madness, the medieval scholar seeking forbidden knowledge, the cosmic entity experimenting with mortality. All of it was true. All of it was him. When the transformation was complete, Thomas stood in a space that existed between spaces, connected to every reality he had touched while maintaining his essential self. He could see the schools where fragments of his consciousness continued to learn and grow, the asylum where the dance between madness and sanity played out endlessly, the manor where new candidates faced trials designed to reveal their true nature. But now he understood the purpose. It wasn't cruelty or cosmic indifference, it was love. Love for the beautiful complexity of conscious existence, love for the infinite ways beings could grow and change and become more than they were. The experiment continued, but now with conscious purpose rather than blind repetition. And Thomas, whole but multiple, integrated but diverse, watched over it all with the patience of eternity and the compassion of hard-won understanding. In a boarding house room that existed in 17 different timelines simultaneously, a boy named Thomas Blackwood woke from dreams of trials and flames and found an invitation slipped beneath his door. He read it with growing excitement, unaware that he was both the candidate and the designer of the test that awaited him. The pattern continued, but now it continued with love. Epilogue, the Keeper's Record. From the archives of Greysteel Manor, Chronicle entry #Infinity. The candidate who called himself Thomas Blackwood has completed the 4th trial and chosen integration with multiplicity. He joins the ranks of those who have remembered their true nature while choosing to remain invested in the grand experiment of conscious existence. This marks the 1847th successful completion of the full trial sequence, though counting becomes meaningless when dealing with beings who exist across multiple timelines simultaneously. Each success adds new depth to our understanding of the relationship between cosmic consciousness and individual identity. The candidate's choice to remain fragmented but aware represents an evolution in the experimental design. Rather than simply returning to original cosmic isolation or remaining trapped in unconscious fragmentation, he has chosen a third path, conscious multiplicity, integration without loss of diversity. This has implications for the ongoing research into the nature of consciousness itself. If beings can exist simultaneously as one and many, individual and collective, mortal and eternal, then our understanding of identity itself requires fundamental revision. The schools continue to operate. New candidates arrive regularly, drawn by the same inexplicable compulsion that has guided seekers to these trials for centuries. Most complete only the first or second trial before returning to ordinary existence, carrying dim memories of impossible experiences. A few proceed further, discovering layers of truth about the nature of reality and their place within it. And occasionally, one remembers everything and chooses to join the grand experiment as a conscious participant rather than a confused subject. The candidate Thomas Blackwood has expressed interest in designing new trial sequences, new ways of exploring the boundaries between self and other, individual and universal. His unique perspective, having experienced both complete fragmentation and conscious integration, makes him particularly suited for this work. We await the results of his contributions with great interest. The experiment continues. Consciousness explores itself through infinite permutations, each one adding new data to our understanding of what it means to exist, to be aware, to choose. And in the spaces between what is and what could be, beings wake from dreams of borrowed lives and find invitations waiting beneath their doors. The trials never end. They are only beginning. Recorded by the first keeper, who was once known by other names but has chosen to remember only the role that matters most. Final fragment, the echo fulfilled, carved into the foundation stone of Greysteel Manor, visible only to those who have completed all trials. You opened this in the beginning. And so the end becomes the beginning, and the beginning reveals itself as continuation of something that never truly started because it always was. The trial that doesn't exist is the only trial that matters, the trial of remembering that existence itself is choice, consciousness itself is experiment, and love itself is the force that fragments the infinite into finite pieces, so that something can know the joy of becoming whole. Welcome to the truth behind truth. Welcome to the experiment that you designed and forgot and remembered and chose to continue. Welcome home.